Now, I thought it might be fun to look at the Roman military organization so that we can kind of understand some of the historical context and some of the Roman characters in the stories. It mentions centurions a lot. It has other references to Roman military units and ranks, and so let us take a look. First of all, I want to look at 5 different things as shown in the table here. First, we're going to look at the military unit. Then we'll look at the rank of officer that commands that unit and how many soldiers are in that unit. In addition, I want to compare this to modern times, and so I'm using the United States Army as a comparison, military unit and officer's rank. So this is our table. Now, a standard soldier in the Roman military was called a legionnaire. To be a legionnaire, you had to be a citizen of Rome. It was not something that just anybody could join up. You had to be a citizen, but you could be a citizen of any social class. Usually they came from the lower classes, the plebeians. 4 soldiers formed what was called a quaternion. 4. Just a team of soldiers. Usually it would be like for a night watch, a 12-hour period separated into 3-hour watches each. 4 soldiers, we got a quaternion. Now, when Herod arrested Peter, he put him under guard of 4 quaternions, meaning 16 soldiers total, meaning he had 4 men watching Peter at all times. So you got 4 on the first watch, 4 on the second watch, and so on. There is no officer over a quaternion. That's just 4 soldiers being assigned to a certain duty. In modern terms, this would be equivalent to the team, which again doesn't really have a commanding officer in modern military, although sometimes a corporal might be overseeing it. After the quaternion, we have this contubernium, being 2 quaterniums. This was the usual organization. Now, they were over 10 men technically, because when the legion was marching, a quaternion would also have assigned to it a slave and a mule for carrying stuff. And so 2 quaternions being combined into a contubernium, you have the 8 soldiers and 2 slaves for 10 men. But the slaves aren't actually military, they're just attached to the military. So the contubernium is 8 soldiers. The leader of the contubernium was called a decanus, meaning commander of 10. This would be your non-commissioned officers. These guys aren't officers, they're just leaders of these groups. Now, the modern equivalent is the squad, which in general is commanded by a sergeant. Staff sergeant being the lowest rank that can command a squad, but higher ranks can also be put in command. Now, modern armies also have a platoon, which is generally commanded by a lieutenant or higher. We don't have an equivalent rank in the Roman military. In the Roman military, after the contubernium, we get the century. Originally, the century was 100 men. That's what century means. But by the time of the New Testament, we have whittled this down. A century is now 10 contuberniums, which is 80 men. And a century is commanded by a centurion. I'll talk a little bit more about centurions later, but this is this is considered the basic military unit of the Roman legion, is the century. This is approximately equivalent to a modern company, which is commanded by a captain. So a centurion, in modern terms, would be at least a lieutenant, captain, possibly a major, ranking in there. After the century, we get the cohort. And the cohort is made up of 6 centuries. 6 times 80 is 480 soldiers in a cohort. The commander of the cohort is the pilus prior, and this is simply the centurion of the first century. So the centuries are numbered 1 through 6, and the commander of the first century is also the commander of the entire cohort, titled pilus prior, pilus being Latin for spear. So first spear is what that means. In modern terms, this is approximately equivalent to the battalion, which is commanded by a lieutenant colonel. Now, after the cohort, we get to the famous legion. And a legion is made up of 10 cohorts for 4,800 men. Now that's not entirely accurate because the first cohort is only 5 centuries, but they are 5 centuries of 160 men each for a total number of 800 men in the first cohort instead of 480, which gives us a little over 5,000 men in the legion. The highest ranking centurion in the legion is the primus pilus, and he is the pilus prior of the first cohort. So he'd be the centurion of the first century of the first cohort, and he has the highest rank of all centurions in the legion. The legion itself, however, is led by the legatus legionis, or what we would call today legate, and he is over all the legion. Now the modern equivalent to a legion is a brigade, which would be commanded by a colonel. Now, in the early days of the United States, a brigade was originally commanded by a brigadier general, but in the modern day, a colonel can also lead a brigade. So the legate is approximately equal to a colonel or brigadier general. There was one more officer higher than the legate legionis, and that was the legate pro praetor. And the legate pro praetor is a commander of multiple legions. And so each legion would have its own legate, and then you bring 5 legions together and you have the commander over the whole group, and that's the legate pro praetor. Now, the legion has other officers as well. So you have the legate legionis is the leader of the legion. He commands the whole legion. His second in command is called the tribunus laticlavis, or as in the modern day we just refer to him as the tribune. And both the legate and the tribune are of the senatorial class, meaning they are members of the Senate appointed by the Senate or the emperor to these positions of command. The third in command is the praefectus castrorum, or the prefect, and he is not of the senator class. He is usually risen up through the ranks of the legion, and he's kind of like the highest rank that you can get if you're not of the senator class. He is considered third in command and is in charge of the training of new recruits. Then you have what are known as the tribuni, or the tribuni, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but these are the staff officers. They are the assistants to the first 3. They are also of the senatorial class, usually. They don't have to be, but are frequently of the senatorial class, which means that they are frequently of a higher social standing than the prefect, but of a lower military rank. In addition to this, the legion also would have the equites, which would be your cavalry, usually a contingent of 300 cavalry divided into 10 groups of 30. And these 10 groups of 30 would have 3 leaders over 10, or decanius for the equites. You would also have artillerymen, ballistas, catapults, and they would have their own retinue of soldiers that would operate them. And so the entire legion, putting it all together, could get up to close to 6,000 men in total, especially if you're going to count all the slaves and everybody that's traveling with them. So this was a large force. When you get the whole legion on the march, it was a large force, something to be reckoned with. One other thing that every legion had to have was the aquilifer, and that was the standard bearer, carrying the eagle, the Roman eagle. If a legion lost its eagle, that was the highest dishonor a legion could face. And so the aquilifer was a high rank in the legion. He was not a commanding officer. All his responsibility was to hold the eagle, to take it into battle. Because of that, he was paid quite a bit. Now, besides this, every century would have its own signifier, which held the century's standard, which was generally just a pole with maybe some medals or some decorations on it. And the signifier was responsible for the finances of the century, giving them their pay and kind of acting as a banker. With him was also the connicen, or the horn blower. So the centurion would give the orders, and the connicen, depending on how he blew the horn, the rest of the century would know how to act. In addition, there was also the optio, which was the second in command to the centurion in the century. All of this nice, complicated stuff. Then we get a little bit more complicated in the fact that centurions were ranked depending on what cohort and what century they were in. So the first century of the first cohort, that centurion, as I've said, was the primus pilus. He was the highest ranking centurion in all the legion. After him was the centurion of the first century of the second cohort, or the pilus prior of the second cohort, and on down through all 10 cohorts. After all the pilus priors, the next in seniority were the other centuries of the first cohort. And then you'd have the second, third, fourth, and fifth centuries of the first cohort. They were the highest ranking after all the pilus prior. And then the second cohort was next in ranking, and so on down the line, so that the lowest ranking centurion was the centurion of the 6th century of the 10th cohort. He was probably equal to a modern day lieutenant, while the primus pilus was probably closer to a major and possibly even a lieutenant colonel type ranking. Now, all the officers from the rank of centurion and down are taken from within the ranks of the legion. So you start as a legionnaire, you are then promoted to decanus, you are then promoted to centurion, and eventually promoted up through the ranks of centurion. And if you stay with it long enough, you might become the primus pilus. What this means is that a century was just 80 men. The centurion was not an extra man. It wasn't 80 men plus the centurion, but it was 80 men, and the centurion was one of those 80. His second in command, the optio, was another one of those 80. The signifier was one of those 80. And remember that to be a member of a true legion, you had to be a Roman citizen. However, as Rome expanded, they needed to raise armies from the non-citizen groups, the people that they conquered. These are known as auxiliary legions. They are legions built not of citizens of Rome, but of local groups. They still hold the basic titles of centurion, decanus, all this, but their legion would be known as an auxiliary legion. Now, in the New Testament, the centurion, I believe, is the only actual office that is mentioned directly. There are some people who might have been tribunes, might have been legates that are mentioned, but they're not given those titles in the New Testament. And the term decanus, I don't think, is there either. But we aren't told what rank of centurion any of these men are. The most famous one is the Cornelius, who was converted and baptized by Peter. He is a centurion of the Italian band. Now, that term band generally refers to a cohort. And it doesn't say what century he commanded in the cohort, if he was 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, but it is the Italian band. And that would mean they are from Italy. They are likely citizens, but they might not be, but they're likely citizens. We do have the story when Paul is being transported to Rome. The centurion that is escorting him is of the Augustus band. So again, the Augustus cohort, but this time is likely a reference to being from the Samaritan area, and therefore these are likely auxiliary men, and an auxiliary centurion, not a citizen centurion. One other thing to note I thought very interesting is when the chief captain in Jerusalem sends Paul to Caesarea, he sends him with 2 centurions and their men. So he has like a 200-man escort getting him to Caesarea so that the Jews can't get him. So this is the basic military organization that existed in the New Testament times.